Consider, if you will, what it takes to make a tyrant pause. Not retreat, not surrender, but simply stop and calculate whether conquest is worth the price. In the summer of 1940, when Nazi armies moved across Europe like a dark tide, swallowing nations in weeks, one small democracy transformed itself into something unprecedented in military history. Not a fortress, not an army, but a trap so elaborate, so expensive to spring, that even Adolf Hitler looked at the maps and decided some prizes cost too much blood. This is the story of how Switzerland became a porcupine, how 4 million people made themselves indigestible, and how their strategy echoes into our present moment with lessons that transcend time itself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The transformation began with a phone call that arrived at dawn on May 10th, 1940. General Henri Guisan, commander of the Swiss Armed Forces, stood in his headquarters as the message came through from border observation posts. German armies had crossed into Belgium. The invasion of Western Europe had begun. What happened next would unfold with a precision that Swiss watchmakers would admire. Within 6 hours, church bells rang in every village across Switzerland, not calling people to prayer, but summoning them to war. 430,000 men left their homes that morning. 1 in 10 Swiss citizens. They walked from farms where spring planting remained unfinished. They stepped away from factory floors where lathes still turned. They left classrooms where students sat waiting for lessons that would not come. This was mobilization, but not as other nations understood it. Every Swiss man between 20 and 60 knew exactly where to report, which uniform to wear, which weapon to collect. They had practiced this ritual annually since childhood, a national choreography of preparation that now transformed from drill into deadly reality. By sunset on that first day, artillery crews had reached their positions in the mountains. These were not professional soldiers in the sense that Germany or France would recognize. They were bankers and watchmakers and dairy farmers who happened to know how to calculate firing solutions with extraordinary precision. They climbed to bunkers that looked like innocent alpine huts, structures that tourists had photographed for years without suspecting what lay behind those rustic timber walls. Inside, they uncovered guns that could reach targets 15 kilometers distant, weapons zeroed on specific points where roads narrowed between cliff faces, where bridges crossed gorges, where an invading army would have no choice but to bunch together into perfect killing zones. Imagine witnessing the speed of what came next. While France still believed its Maginot Line would hold, while British forces scrambled to reach defensive positions in Belgium, Swiss engineers moved through their country with predetermined purpose. They carried explosives to 3,000 bridges and tunnels, not to destroy them yet, but to prepare them for instant destruction. Each charge had been surveyed years before, calculated to drop spans precisely, to collapse tunnels completely, to sever every artery that connected Switzerland to the outside world. The engineers worked in teams that had rehearsed these exact movements in peacetime exercises. They knew which beam to brace, which support to undermine, which fuse to set. By the end of that first week, as German panzers broke through French lines that were supposed to be impregnable, Switzerland had become a nation that could choose isolation in minutes. 17,000 tons of explosives now sat ready beneath Switzerland's infrastructure. To understand that quantity, picture it this way. The atomic bomb that destroyed Hiroshima released energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. Switzerland had positioned enough conventional explosives to sever itself from Europe, with a force approaching nuclear scale, distributed across thousands of precisely chosen points. This was not mere preparation. This was a statement written in gunpowder and granite, a declaration that said, "We would rather destroy everything we have built than surrender it to tyranny." The speed of France's collapse shocked the world. 6 weeks. 6 weeks for the nation with Europe's largest army, the nation that had stood firm for 4 years in the First World War, to sign an armistice with Germany. Paris fell on June 14, 1940. The French government fled to Bordeaux, then to Vichy. By June 22nd, the armistice was signed. Switzerland now found itself completely surrounded by Axis powers. Germany to the north, Vichy France, essentially a German puppet to the west, fascist Italy to the south and east. 4.2 million Swiss citizens stood alone in the heart of occupied Europe, a democratic island in a totalitarian sea. General Guisan understood what this moment demanded, not just military preparation, but a renewal of national spirit, a reminder of why Switzerland existed at all. He sent a message to his senior officers. They were to gather on July 25th at a specific location, a meadow above Lake Lucerne called Rutli. This was no arbitrary choice. The Rutli meadow was sacred ground, the place where, according to Swiss tradition, the representatives of the 3 original cantons had sworn an oath in 1291 that created Switzerland itself. By choosing this location, Guisan connected the existential threat of 1940 to the founding moment of Swiss independence 650 years earlier. 250 officers assembled in that meadow on a summer morning. They stood in a semicircle facing their general, with Lake Lucerne stretching blue and peaceful below them, and the Alps rising eternal and white beyond. The contrast could not have been more profound. Behind them, the most beautiful landscape in Europe. Before them, a continent being devoured by mechanized warfare. Guisan spoke words that every Swiss person alive that summer would come to know by heart. "We will fight from village to village, from hill to hill," he told them. His voice carried across the meadow, measured and certain. "When we can fight no more, we will destroy everything and fight on from the ruins." He paused, letting the words settle into the minds of men who understood their weight. Switzerland can survive only as an independent nation, faithful to its traditions and its mission. Any other existence would be unworthy of our history and our character. Consider what he was promising. Total resistance, not surrender when the situation became hopeless, but escalation. Not negotiation when the enemy seemed overwhelming, but annihilation of everything rather than occupation. This was not the language of military strategy. This was existential commitment, a declaration that Switzerland would rather cease to exist than exist unfree. The officers who heard these words returned to their commands carrying not just orders, but a covenant. They would make Switzerland unconquerable, or they would make it ungovernable, and either way, they would deny Hitler what he wanted most, an easy victory. Behind Guisan as he spoke, invisible to those assembled officers, but very much present in their awareness, lay the fruits of decades of preparation. The mountains held secrets, not metaphorically, but literally. Carved into the granite of the Alps were 250 fortresses, ranging from small bunkers holding a dozen men to massive complexes that could shelter hundreds. These were not crude excavations. They were sophisticated military installations with their own power generation, their own water supplies, their own ventilation systems capable of filtering poison gas. They had been built in absolute secrecy, designed to remain hidden until the moment they opened fire. The camouflage reached levels of artistry that seem almost absurd in their dedication to deception. Engineers and stonemasons worked together to create artificial rock faces that concealed artillery batteries. They studied the natural geology of each location, matched the color and texture of the native stone, even added lichen and weathering to make their creations indistinguishable from the surrounding cliff. Gun ports looked like natural cracks in the rock. Ventilation shafts emerged through fake boulders. Entire fortresses hid behind facades of alpine chalets, complete with flower boxes and shutters that, when opened, revealed not windows but the barrels of anti-tank guns. In villages throughout the country, innocent-looking barns concealed ammunition stockpiles. Beneath village squares, underground magazines held millions of rounds of small arms ammunition, thousands of artillery shells, tons of explosives. The quantities stagger the imagination. 50 million rifle rounds distributed across hundreds of hidden depots. Enough ammunition to sustain continuous combat for months. Enough explosives to rebuild the demolition charges dozens of times over. The Swiss had calculated not just for initial defense, but for sustained resistance, for the kind of grinding warfare that would make occupation as expensive as invasion. The civilian population understood their role in this system with clarity that came from centuries of militia tradition. Swiss men trained regularly throughout their adult lives. They kept their rifles at home, along with sealed ammunition. They knew their assembly points, their sectors of responsibility, their fields of fire. This was not a professional army in the European sense. It was an armed nation, and the distinction mattered enormously. A professional army might be defeated, might surrender when high command ordered it. An armed nation had no single point of failure. Even if the government fell, even if generals were captured, the defense would continue because the defense was not centralized. It was distributed across every village, every valley, every mountain pass. The defensive strategy that emerged had a name: the National Redoubt. The concept was brutal in its logic. If Germany invaded, Swiss forces would not try to defend the entire border. That would spread them too thin, would allow German advantages in numbers and equipment to overwhelm Swiss positions. Instead, the plan called for fighting withdrawals that would funnel German forces into predetermined killing zones in the Alps. The northern plains, the industrial cities, even the capital of Bern, all these would be abandoned if necessary. The Swiss would retreat into the mountains, into terrain where every advantage shifted in their favor, and they would make those mountains into a fortress that could not be taken. This was not defeatism. This was physics. In mountain warfare, elevation equals power. A single machine gun crew positioned on a height can dominate a valley floor. Artillery firing downward gains range and accuracy. Defenders can prepare positions over years, can pre-position supplies, can wire escape routes and fallback positions. Attackers must climb under fire, must expose themselves to reach each successive defensive line, must carry everything they need up slopes that exhaust even fit men. The Swiss studied their terrain with scientific precision and calculated exactly how to maximize these advantages. They identified every choke point, every position where geography would force attackers to bunch together, every slope steep enough to channel assault routes into predictable paths. The mathematics of this defense gave German military planners nightmares. They ran scenario after scenario, war-gamed different approaches, calculated casualties and time requirements. Every simulation produced the same grim conclusion. Conquering Switzerland would be expensive beyond any rational cost-benefit analysis. Not impossible, but expensive. And expense, in warfare, means something very specific. It means dead soldiers. It means destroyed equipment. It means time when those forces could be fighting elsewhere. In the summer of 1940, with Britain still defiant and plans for invading the Soviet Union already germinating in Hitler's mind, Switzerland represented a commitment that Germany's strategic position could not afford, yet the threat remained real. German generals prepared Operation Tannenbaum, the codename for Switzerland's invasion. They identified 12 divisions as the minimum force required. They mapped out assault routes, designated objectives, calculated logistics. The plans existed, ready to be executed if Hitler gave the order, and Switzerland knew about them. Swiss intelligence, reading German communications through various means, including captured Enigma material, tracked every development. They knew when German divisions moved to their northern border. They knew when reconnaissance aircraft photographed Swiss positions. They knew how close they stood to the edge. So Switzerland prepared a final guarantee. The demolitions they had rigged across 3,000 bridges and tunnels were not merely defensive, they were a doomsday device, a way to make their country useless even if conquered. If German forces entered Switzerland, those charges would blow. Every rail line severed, every road bridge dropped, every mountain tunnel collapsed. Switzerland would isolate itself completely, would transform from a crossroads of Europe into an impassable barrier. German forces might eventually prevail, might grind through the mountain defences and occupy the rubble. But what would they have gained? A wrecked landscape requiring years to reconstruct, at a cost in blood and material that would cripple their wider war effort. The Swiss practiced this. Isolation constantly. Mobilization exercises tested how quickly forces could reach their positions. Demolition teams ran drills timing how fast they could prepare and execute their charges. The population stockpiled food, converted basements into shelters, organized civilian defense networks. This was a nation that had decided, collectively and deliberately, that freedom had a price they were willing to pay. That price might be their prosperity, their infrastructure, their lives, but never their independence. As summer turned to autumn in 1940, Switzerland stood alone and armed in the heart of Hitler's Europe. The Wehrmacht had conquered Poland in 5 weeks, Norway in 2 months, Denmark in hours, the Netherlands in 5 days, Belgium in 18 days, and France in 6 weeks. Against this military machine, the most successful in human history to that point, Switzerland had only its mountains, its training, and its absolute determination to make invasion catastrophic. The world watched to see if preparation and will could substitute for power, if a small nation could make itself indigestible through pure strategic brilliance, if the porcupine could survive among wolves. There exists a peculiar beauty in military planning, a cold elegance in the way staff officers translate terrain and weapons into equations of death. The Wehrmacht possessed some of the finest military minds in the world, officers who had rewritten the textbook on modern warfare, who had achieved in months what Germany failed to accomplish in 4 years during the First World War. These were not fools. They were professionals who approached problems with Prussian thoroughness and mathematical rigor. And when they turned their attention to Switzerland, they discovered something that rarely appeared in their calculations, a problem without a good solution. The task fell primarily to Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff. A brilliant strategist, Halder had helped plan the Bifreit, invasions that shattered Poland and France. He approached Switzerland with the same methodical analysis, assembling his best officers to study maps, terrain reports, intelligence assessments, and demographic data. They worked for 16 months, from the summer of 1940 through the autumn of 1941, running scenarios and refining their invasion plan. What they produced was Operation Tannenbaum, named for the fir tree, a comprehensive blueprint for conquering Switzerland. But woven through every page of that plan was a subtext of reluctance, a recognition that this particular conquest would violate the fundamental principle of military efficiency, achieving objectives at acceptable cost. The initial assessment called for 21 divisions. To understand what that meant, consider that Germany had used approximately 135 divisions to conquer France, a nation of 42 million people with a professional army of nearly 5 million men. Switzerland had 4.2 million people and could mobilize, at maximum stretch, perhaps 450,000 soldiers. By proportion, Switzerland should have required perhaps 3 or 4 divisions to overwhelm. Yet Halder's staff calculated that 21 divisions represented the minimum credible force. This discrepancy tells you everything about what made Switzerland different. The core problem was geography, and geography does not negotiate. The Alps occupy approximately 60% of Switzerland's land area. These are not gentle hills. They are young mountains, geologically speaking, thrust upward, where the African tectonic plate grinds against the European plate. They feature peaks exceeding 4,000 meters in elevation, glaciers that have carved valleys into deep gorges, and passes that close completely under winter snow. For defensive purposes, this terrain is nearly ideal. It channels movement into predictable routes. It multiplies the effectiveness of prepared positions. And most critically, it reverses the normal mathematics of warfare. In conventional combat on open terrain, attackers typically need a 3-to-1 numerical advantage to overcome prepared defenders. This ratio accounts for the fact that defenders have cover, know the ground, and can concentrate their fire while attackers must advance under fire across exposed ground. Mountain warfare changes this equation dramatically. The Swiss General Staff had calculated, based on historical analysis and their own exercises, that in alpine terrain, defenders could inflict casualties at a ratio of 6 or even 8-to-1. This meant that Switzerland's 450,000 soldiers, properly positioned and supplied, could theoretically inflict 2.7 million casualties before being defeated. The math was grotesque, but it was also persuasive. German planners looked at specific objectives and calculated specific costs. Take the Saint-Maurice fortress, one of Switzerland's most powerful defensive positions. Saint-Maurice controlled the Rhône Valley, the primary route from France into Switzerland's central plateau. The fortress consisted of multiple underground installations carved into the mountainside, with heavy artillery capable of engaging targets across the entire valley floor. German engineers studied this position and concluded that taking it would require a full-scale assault by at least 2 divisions, with expected casualties of 15,000 men. 15,000 casualties to capture one fortress, and Switzerland had dozens of such positions. The Wehrmacht ran simulations of an assault through the Gotthard Pass, perhaps Switzerland's most famous alpine crossing. The pass itself, at its narrowest point, measured just 80 meters wide. On either side, cliffs rose nearly vertical. A Swiss battalion, positioned in prepared fortifications with pre-sighted artillery and mortars, could engage targets in that narrow defile, with devastating precision. German planners calculated that attempting to force the Gotthard would destroy an entire division in approximately 4 hours. Not defeat it, destroy it. The distinction matters. A defeated unit retreats, regroups, can fight again. A destroyed unit ceases to exist as a functioning military formation. These calculations assumed, of course, that the Swiss would fight conventionally, that they would man their positions and engage in straightforward defensive combat. But Swiss planning included something far more extreme. The Saint-Maurice fortress contained magazines storing explosives sufficient to generate a blast of approximately 12 kilotons when detonated simultaneously. 12 kilotons. The Hiroshima atomic bomb released approximately 15 kilotons of energy. Switzerland had essentially created nuclear-scale conventional explosives, positioned to collapse entire mountain valleys and bury attacking forces under megatons of rubble. This was the Swiss doctrine of total defense taken to its logical extreme. If a position could not be held, it would be annihilated along with everyone attacking it. Every major fortress, every critical tunnel, every important bridge had demolition charges, sufficient not merely to destroy the structure, but to fundamentally alter the landscape. The Germans understood this. Their intelligence services photographed these preparations, documented the quantities of explosives, calculated the effects. What they concluded should have been obvious. Conquering Switzerland would require fighting through a country that was systematically destroying itself ahead of the advance, removing the very infrastructure that made conquest valuable. But warfare is not only about immediate military objectives. It encompasses logistics, time, and opportunity cost. The Wehrmacht in 1940 was the most mobile, most mechanized military force that had ever existed. German success in Poland and France derived largely From rapid movement, from the ability to concentrate forces, punch through defences, and exploit breakthroughs before enemies could react, Switzerland nullified every aspect of this advantage. The terrain prevented rapid movement, the defensive positions prevented breakthrough, and even if breakthroughs occurred, the systematic demolition of infrastructure prevented exploitation. Consider what German logistics officers faced when planning Operation Tannenbaum. Modern mechanized armies consume enormous quantities of fuel, ammunition, and supplies. A single panzer division required approximately 300 tons of supplies daily. 21 divisions would need over 6,000 tons per day. In France, Germany had used the excellent French road and rail network to move these supplies. In Switzerland, that network would be destroyed systematically as German forces advanced, every bridge blown, every tunnel collapsed, every rail line severed. Supply columns would have to rely on mountain roads that could be interdicted easily from prepared positions. The logistics were not merely difficult, they approached impossible. The temporal dimension created additional nightmares for German planners. Their simulations suggested that conquering Switzerland completely, including reducing all mountain fortresses, would require a minimum of 3 months, and potentially as long as 6 months. 3 to 6 months, during which 21 divisions would be tied down in mountain warfare, while producing no strategic benefit to Germany's wider war effort. In the summer of 1940, Germany was planning to invade Britain. By summer 1941, plans for invading the Soviet Union were taking final shape. Operation Barbarossa would eventually employ 3 million men across a front of nearly 3,000 kilometers. Could Germany afford to commit 500,000 men to conquering Switzerland when those forces might be decisive elsewhere? The economic calculations proved equally uncomfortable. Switzerland's economy had become intricately woven into the German war machine in ways that made the country far more valuable intact than conquered. Swiss factories produced precision instruments, ball bearings, and watch movements that German military manufacturing depended upon. 70% of German artillery fuses contained Swiss-made components. 40% of German time fuses came from Swiss production. These were not luxury items. They were essential military hardware that could not be easily replaced from other sources. Switzerland's financial system presented an even more complex consideration. Swiss banks processed approximately 2 billion Swiss francs of Nazi gold annually, converting plundered assets into currency that Germany could use for international purchases. This gold came from various sources, some legitimate, much of it not. Swiss bankers did not ask uncomfortable questions, and this willful blindness made Switzerland extraordinarily useful to Germany. But conquest would end this arrangement. Occupied Switzerland could not maintain banking neutrality. The accounts would freeze. The transactions would stop. Germany would lose one of its few remaining channels for converting gold into hard currency. The transit question created its own strategic dilemma. Switzerland controlled the primary rail routes connecting Germany to Italy. 11,000 rail cars daily moved through Swiss territory, carrying Italian coal northward and German-manufactured goods south. This traffic was essential to the Axis alliance. Italian coal fueled German industry. German equipment armed Italian forces. The Alpine tunnels that made this trade possible could be destroyed in minutes by Swiss engineers. German planners understood that invading Switzerland would sever this vital connection, potentially crippling both German industry and the Italian war effort. Franz Halder compiled all these calculations into a report that landed on Hitler's desk in late summer 1940. The document ran to hundreds of pages, but its core conclusion could be summarized simply. Conquering Switzerland would cost 500,000 men, minimum casualties of 100,000 in the first week, 3 to 6 months of intensive combat, and would yield a devastated country whose infrastructure would require years to rebuild. The strategic benefit? Essentially none. Switzerland produced nothing. Germany could not obtain more easily through trade. It occupied no territory essential to German war aims. It threatened no German objectives. The Führer read this report, and by various accounts, his reaction mixed rage with frustration. Hitler despised Switzerland, considered it an affront to German destiny, a stubborn anachronism that had no place in his vision of a unified Europe. He wanted to eliminate it. But Hitler, for all his ideological fervour, understood military realities. He had personally experienced the First World War, had seen what happened when nations pursued objectives that exceeded their means. He knew that warfare, at its core, remained an exercise in applied mathematics, and the mathematics of conquering Switzerland did not support the expenditure, yet the invasion plan remained active. German forces massed along Switzerland's borders in August 1940, a show of force designed to intimidate. 12 divisions concentrated on the northern frontier, while 6 Italian divisions threatened from the south. 300,000 men, with 2,000 tanks, sat poised to strike. The Swiss watched this build-up through binoculars and artillery sights, calculating ranges and trajectories, updating their firing solutions. Switzerland's response to this threat demonstrated the psychological sophistication of their strategy. They did not back down. They did not offer concessions. Instead, they escalated. General Guisan ordered all demolition charges armed and ready for immediate execution. The code word for total destruction of Switzerland's infrastructure was transmitted to every engineer unit: Ragnarok. The choice of this word was not accidental. In Norse mythology, Ragnarok represents the apocalyptic end of the world, the final battle where gods and giants destroy each other in mutual annihilation. Switzerland was signaling that invasion would trigger their own version of apocalypse, a systematic erasure of everything that made their country valuable or accessible. German signals intelligence intercepted these orders. Wehrmacht engineers studied the demolition plans and calculated the effects. Their conclusion confirmed Swiss intentions. Switzerland could sever every connection to Europe in approximately 6 minutes. 6 minutes from the order to execute until the last charges detonated. The country would become an isolated fortress, approachable only by mountain trails and alpine passes that could be defended indefinitely. The psychological impact of this capability cannot be overstated. Switzerland was not threatening to fight hard. They were threatening to make victory meaningless. The tension peaked in late August 1940, then slowly began to ease. German divisions withdrew from the border, redeployed to other fronts. The immediate threat passed, but Operation Tannenbaum remained on file, continued to be updated with new intelligence, remained a viable plan should circumstances change. Switzerland continued to prepare, continued to drill, continued to wire every bridge and tunnel with charges that could erase the country from Hitler's reach in the time it takes to boil water. What the Wehrmacht discovered, through their months of planning and calculation, was that Switzerland had created something genuinely novel in military history. Not merely a strong defence, but an impossible cost-benefit analysis. Every nation can be conquered if an attacker is willing to pay a sufficient price, but Switzerland had made that price exceed any rational strategic calculation. They had transformed their country into a military problem with no elegant solution, a trap that would destroy the attacker almost as thoroughly as the defender. In the cold mathematics of warfare, this made Switzerland invincible not through strength, but through the calculated promise of mutual devastation. The porcupine had done more than grow quills. It had made itself poisonous to consume. There are places in this world that exist in 2 states simultaneously, like quantum particles suspended between realities. To the casual observer, they appear as one thing. To those who know where to look, they reveal themselves as something entirely different. The Swiss Alps, in the years of the Second World War, embodied this duality perfectly. Tourists saw pristine mountain villages, alpine meadows dotted with cattle, granite peaks soaring into crystalline air. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed the same landscape and saw something else entirely. A fortress so vast and so cunningly concealed that even their best intelligence analysts could identify only 40% of its positions after 4 years of intensive surveillance. The crown jewel of this hidden fortress system bore the name Sasso da Pigna, which translates roughly as Rock of the Pine Cone. It lay buried deep beneath the Gotthard Massif, the mountain complex that forms the spine of the Swiss Alps. To reach it, you would have entered through what appeared to be a maintenance shed near a small mountain road, the kind of structure that might house equipment for clearing avalanches or maintaining power lines. Inside that shed, a steel door opened onto a tunnel that descended into living granite. The tunnel stretched 300 meters into the mountain, angling downward, its walls lined with electric lighting powered by generators that could run for weeks without refueling. At the end of that tunnel, the passage opened into chambers that defied the simple word bunker. This was an underground installation the size of a small town, with quarters for 100 men, kitchens capable of preparing 3 meals daily for months, storage rooms holding enough food to sustain the garrison for half a year, and ammunition magazines containing 90 days' worth of shells for continuous combat. The men stationed here could seal themselves inside, could survive a siege that lasted seasons, could continue fighting long after the surface world had moved on to other battles. But Sasso da Pigna existed not for survival, but for murder. Its primary purpose lived in the artillery chambers, caverns carved from solid rock to house guns that could obliterate anything moving through the valley below. These were not small weapons. They were heavy artillery pieces, the kind normally mounted on battleships or used in siege warfare, weapons capable of firing shells weighing 50 kilograms to distances exceeding 15 kilometers. The gunners who manned these weapons had spent years memorizing every meter of their firing zone, calculating trajectories for every possible target, pre-sighting coordinates for intersections, bridges, the assembly areas, anywhere an attacking force might concentrate. The genius of the installation lay in its invisibility. From the valley floor, scanning the mountainside with binoculars or cameras, you would see nothing but natural granite formations. The gun ports, when closed, disappeared completely into the rock face. Swiss engineers had studied the natural fracture patterns of the local stone, had carved openings that followed these patterns, had installed steel shutters that matched the color and texture of weathered granite perfectly. Only when those shutters opened would the guns reveal themselves, and by then it would be far too late for anyone caught in their sights. Consider the calculation from an attacker's perspective. German forces attempting to move through the valley would have no indication of danger until the Most Pound. First shells began falling. Artillery observers in Sasso da Pigna, watching through carefully concealed observation posts, would wait for the optimal moment, not when the first vehicles appeared, but when an entire column had entered the kill zone, when retreat would be as dangerous as advance, when maximum destruction could be achieved. Then the guns would speak, and a German division would discover it had walked into an ambush measured in tons of high explosive. Sasso da Pigna represented just one node in a defensive network, so elaborate that modern military historians still discover new details when classified documents are released. By 1941, Switzerland had constructed 26,000 permanent defensive positions. 26,000. The number almost defies comprehension. These ranged from simple machine gun nests built into roadside walls to massive fortress complexes housing thousands of tons of ammunition. Each position had been surveyed, planned, and constructed with meticulous attention to fields of fire, mutual support, and camouflage. The smaller installations demonstrated equal creativity and concealment. A machine gun nest might be built into what appeared to be a woodshed beside a farm. The farmer who owned the land would know about it, would maintain the shed's appearance, would ensure that firewood always stacked naturally against the walls. But behind those walls, steel firing ports waited, pre-aimed at specific points on the road below. A squad of soldiers could occupy that position in minutes, could bring their weapon into action while appearing to be nothing more than a rural storage building. Some positions achieved concealment through pure audacity. Swiss engineers constructed entire artillery batteries inside artificial rock formations that took master stonemasons months to create. These craftsmen would study photographs of natural outcrops, would examine the geology of the area, would then build false rocks from reinforced concrete that mimicked nature with extraordinary precision. They matched the color of the local stone by grinding samples and mixing the powder into their concrete. They created weathering patterns using acids and abrasives. They even transplanted lichen from nearby rocks to their creations, letting nature complete the disguise over seasons. The result fooled even expert observers. German aerial reconnaissance photographed these positions repeatedly, and their analysts marked them as natural features. Only when Swiss veterans began publishing memoirs after the war did the full extent of this deception become clear. Positions that German intelligence had confidently identified as genuine mountainside turned out to be elaborate hides, concealing multiple artillery pieces. The mountains themselves had become weapons, or rather, weapons had become indistinguishable from mountains. Fort Sargans exemplified the pinnacle of Swiss fortress design. This installation guarded the Rhine Valley, the primary invasion route from Germany into Switzerland's eastern plateau. The fort's main armament consisted of 15-centimeter guns, artillery pieces capable of firing a 45-kilogram shell to a range of 23 kilometers. These guns occupied positions carved into the Gonsen Mountain, protected by dozens of meters of solid rock above them, supplied through tunnels that connected to magazines holding thousands of shells. The fort's fire control system demonstrated the Swiss gift for precision engineering. Gun crews did not aim their weapons by direct observation. Instead, they received firing data from forward observers positioned in carefully hidden observation posts throughout the valley. These observers could see German forces assembling near the Rhine bridges, could calculate exact positions using surveyed reference points, could transmit coordinates back to the fort through telephone lines buried deep underground. The guns would then fire on targets their crews never saw, dropping shells with devastating accuracy on predetermined grid squares. The Rhine bridges themselves presented German planners with an impossible problem. To invade Switzerland from the north, armor and heavy equipment would have to cross the Rhine. The bridges offered the only viable crossing points for tanks and trucks, but every bridge sat within range of Swiss artillery, and Swiss gunners had calculated the precise firing solutions required to destroy them. Fort Sargans alone could drop 20 tons of shells per minute onto the Rhine crossings, a rate of fire that would turn any attempted crossing into a massacre measured in seconds. This defensive system emerged not from sudden inspiration, but from 6 centuries of accumulated knowledge. Switzerland's military tradition stretched back to the medieval period, when Swiss pike formations proved they could defeat armored knights through discipline and tactical innovation. These early Swiss soldiers learned fundamental truths about warfare that remained valid into the modern age. Preparation defeats improvisation, knowledge of terrain trumps numerical advantage, and the will to fight multiplies the effectiveness of every weapon. Each generation of Swiss soldiers built upon the lessons of their predecessors. During the Napoleonic Wars, Switzerland learned how European powers viewed small nations, as obstacles to be swept aside or prizes to be claimed. During the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, Switzerland observed how modern warfare could erupt with frightening speed, how nations could find themselves unprepared and overwhelmed within weeks. These lessons crystallized into doctrine: prepare always, assume nothing, and make the price of conquest exceed any rational calculation. The fortress construction program began in earnest during the 1880s, accelerated after World War I, and reached its zenith in the 1930s as Nazi Germany's intentions became unmistakable. Engineers learned to work with alpine geology to identify stable rock formations capable of supporting underground installations, to solve problems of ventilation in deep tunnels, to create drainage systems that prevented flooding, to design blast doors that could withstand direct hits from heavy artillery. The knowledge became institutional, passed through military academies and engineering schools, refined through constant exercises. Young officers studied historical battles in alpine terrain, analyzed what worked and what failed, incorporated those lessons into current planning. The result was a defensive system that represented not individual genius, but collective wisdom. The accumulated insight of generations focused on a single problem: how to make Switzerland unconquerable. By 1940, this system had matured into something unprecedented. Other nations had fortifications. France had the Maginot Line. Belgium had Fort Eben-Emael. Germany had the West Wall. But these were linear defences, designed to block specific approaches, vulnerable to flanking or breakthrough. Switzerland's defence was three-dimensional, distributed throughout the entire country with no single point of failure. Destroy one position, and 10 others remained. Break through one valley, and 3 more had to be conquered. It was not a fortress, it was a fortress system, resilient through redundancy, effective through depth. The human element completed the system. The fortresses, for all their technical sophistication, remained inert without trained crews to man them. Switzerland's militia system ensured that every position had designated personnel who trained regularly at their specific locations. These men knew their fortresses intimately, knew which valve controlled which system, which tunnel led where, how to clear a jammed breach or repair a damaged power line. This familiarity bred confidence, and confidence multiplied effectiveness. The fortress crews understood something essential. They were not expected to win. They were expected to make victory cost more than it was worth. A crew in an isolated bunker might eventually be overrun, might exhaust their ammunition or supplies, might face overwhelming force, but before that happened, they would exact a terrible price. They would destroy bridges and block passes. They would call artillery strikes on advancing forces. They would fight from prepared positions where every advantage belonged to the defender. And when they could fight no more, they would demolish their own position, denying the enemy even the satisfaction of capture. This acceptance of sacrifice without expectation of survival created a psychological weapon as effective as any artillery piece. German planners knew that Swiss positions would not surrender easily, that each fortress would require costly assault, that even success would come at a price that accumulated with every position taken. The mathematics of attrition favoured the defender absolutely. Switzerland could afford to lose positions slowly, could trade space for casualties, could make each kilometre of advance cost thousands of lives. Germany, operating on the strategic offensive across all of Europe, could not afford such expenditure for objectives that offered no strategic benefit. The fortresses also served a political purpose. They embodied Swiss determination in concrete and steel, made visible and tangible the abstract concept of defensive will. When Swiss citizens looked at their mountains and knew what lay hidden there, when soldiers trained in those installations and understood their power, when politicians negotiated with Germany from positions backed by thousands of prepared defensive positions, the fortresses provided leverage that transcended their immediate military value. German intelligence worked tirelessly to map Swiss defences, to identify positions and calculate their capabilities. Agents photographed suspicious locations. Reconnaissance aircraft flew countless missions over Swiss territory, often being shot down for their trouble. Switzerland protested these violations formally while shooting down German aircraft with satisfying regularity. 217 times during the war years. Each shoot-down sent a message. Swiss airspace was defended, Swiss sovereignty was not negotiable, and Swiss anti-aircraft gunners were quite competent. Yet despite this intensive intelligence effort, Germany never achieved complete knowledge of Swiss defensive positions. The 60% identification rate meant that 4 out of every 10 Swiss installations remained undetected. German commanders planning assaults would face the terrifying uncertainty of hidden guns opening fire from unexpected positions, of artillery falling from mountains that appeared unoccupied, of defensive lines extending behind what seemed to be the final position. In military planning, uncertainty multiplies risk, and risk limits ambition. The fortress system, in its final form, represented an extraordinary achievement of engineering, planning, and national commitment. It transformed Switzerland from a nation that could be conquered into a nation that chose whether to be conquered, that could accept invasion only on terms so expensive that no rational attacker would proceed. The mountains had always been there, geological facts predating human civilization, but Switzerland had transformed those geological facts into strategic reality, had weaponized geography itself, had made the Alps not merely obstacles but active participants in national defense. The shadows in those mountains concealed more than rock and ice. They concealed the determination of a people who refused to bend, codified in steel and granite, waiting with infinite patience for enemies who, in the end, chose not to come. There exists a particular kind of courage that has no name in most languages, a bravery that consists not of facing danger directly but of walking between dangers, maintaining balance on a razor's edge where one misstep means annihilation. While Swiss artillery crews trained their guns on German approach routes, Swiss bankers performed an equally delicate operation, one that required nerves of steel and moral flexibility that still troubles consciences today. They were dancing with devils, providing just enough cooperation to make invasion unnecessary while maintaining just enough independence to remain free. Picture Zurich's Bahnhofstrasse, one of the world's most exclusive banking districts. In the spring of 1941, the street appeared calm, almost serene. Well-dressed bankers walked between buildings whose architecture spoke of permanence and discretion. Nothing in the street scene suggested the extraordinary moral complexity occurring inside those buildings. 3 floors below street level, in vaults protected by time locks and armed guards, Nazi gold sat stacked in careful rows. $800 million worth in today's currency, bars stamped with the eagle and swastika of the Third Reich. 2 floors above those same vaults, in accounts separated by nothing more than accounting ledgers and Swiss confidentiality laws, sat Allied assets worth twice that amount. British investments, American holdings, French accounts frozen when France fell, all protected by the same Swiss banks that processed Nazi gold. This financial architecture created a form of mutual assured destruction more elegant than any weapons system. Switzerland held assets that every major power valued. Attack Switzerland, and those assets would vanish into legal limbo that might take decades to unravel. The moral arithmetic of this arrangement defies simple judgment. Swiss bankers knew, or certainly suspected, that not all Nazi gold arrived through legitimate channels. Some bars had been melted down from jewelry confiscated from Holocaust victims. Some came from national reserves, looted from conquered nations. The swastika stamped on each bar should have raised questions that Swiss banking discretion chose not to ask. Yet this willful blindness served a purpose beyond profit. It made Switzerland useful to Germany, created a financial relationship that gave the Swiss leverage. Consider the transaction from both perspectives. Germany needed ways to convert plundered gold into currency it could use internationally. Switzerland provided that service, taking a commission for doing so, but more importantly, creating a dependency. German industries relied on materials purchased with this converted currency. German agents used Swiss accounts to fund operations in neutral countries. Break this financial relationship, and Germany's war economy would suffer immediately. This gave Switzerland something that small nations rarely possess: the ability to make themselves valuable to a stronger power while maintaining independence. Allen Dulles understood this dynamic perhaps better than anyone. The future director of the CIA spent the war years running America's Office of Strategic Services from a modest apartment in Bern. From his windows overlooking the Aare River, Dulles coordinated an intelligence network that gathered information from across occupied Europe. What made his operation possible was Switzerland's unique position. German officers could travel to Switzerland for business meetings without arousing suspicion from their own security services. Once in Switzerland, those officers could make contact with American intelligence, could pass information, could begin establishing connections that might prove valuable should Germany lose the war. These meetings occurred in cafes and hotel lobbies, conversations conducted in low voices, while other patrons drank coffee and pretended not to notice. German officers brought intelligence about troop movements, about weapons development, about political tensions within the Nazi hierarchy. Dulles and his agents received this information, evaluated its reliability, and transmitted it to Washington and London. Switzerland made this intelligence traffic possible by maintaining its neutrality, by creating a space where enemies could meet without immediate consequence. The Swiss intelligence service played an even more intricate game. They had obtained Enigma codebooks through various means, some purchased, some stolen, some provided by Polish intelligence before Poland fell. This gave Switzerland the ability to read encrypted German communications, a capability they guarded with absolute secrecy. They shared select information with all sides, carefully calibrating what to reveal and what to conceal, using intelligence as currency to purchase goodwill and protection. This triple game required exquisite judgment. Share too much with the Allies, and Germany might discover the betrayal and invade. Share too much with Germany, and the Allies might conclude Switzerland had chosen sides and act accordingly after victory. The Swiss had to walk between these extremes, providing enough to each side to seem cooperative, while never providing so much that they became dependent on one side's victory. The human cost of this neutrality weighed heavily. At Switzerland's borders, refugees arrived desperate for sanctuary, Jewish families fleeing persecution, political dissidents escaping Nazi vengeance, Allied soldiers who had escaped from prisoner of war camps, pilots shot down over occupied territory. Swiss border guards faced impossible decisions daily, decisions that determined who lived and who died, decisions made under policies that prioritized Swiss security over humanitarian concerns. The statistics carry their own condemnation. Switzerland turned away 24,000 Jewish refugees at the border during the war years, 24,000 people who sought safety and found doors closed. Many of those people died in the Holocaust that followed their rejection. This, the decision haunts Switzerland still, represents a stain on the nation's conscience that no amount of subsequent apology can fully cleanse. The rationale offered was survival. Switzerland could not accommodate unlimited refugees without provoking German invasion. But rationale does not resurrect the dead. Yet alongside this failure lived acts of courage and compassion. 62,000 refugees found sanctuary in Switzerland during the war, families sheltered in converted schools and hotels. Children separated from parents who died in concentration camps found foster homes with Swiss families. 5,000 Allied airmen shot down over occupied Europe and somehow making their way to Swiss territory received internment that was, in practice, quite comfortable. They lived in camps with minimal security, received Red Cross packages, and generally waited out the war in conditions far better than German prison camps offered. Individual Swiss citizens made their own moral choices, sometimes in defiance of official policy. Border guards looked the other way when refugees crossed at night. Families hid people in attics and basements. Church groups organized smuggling networks to bring refugees across from occupied France. These individual acts of conscience could not erase the larger policy failures, but they demonstrated that even within a system prioritizing survival, human compassion found ways to express itself. The economic entanglement grew deeper as the war continued. Swiss factories produced components for German weapons. 40% of German artillery time fuses came from Swiss production. 35% of ball bearings used in German machinery originated in Swiss factories. These were not luxury items. They were essential military supplies that kept the Wehrmacht fighting. Without Swiss production, German artillery would have fired more slowly, German aircraft would have grounded more frequently, German tanks would have broken down more often. This industrial collaboration represents perhaps the most troubling aspect of Swiss neutrality. While Swiss soldiers trained to resist German invasion, Swiss factory workers produced materials that helped Germany conquer other nations. The contradiction seems impossible to reconcile. Yet from the Swiss perspective, this contradiction was precisely the point. They were making themselves too useful to destroy, creating dependencies that gave them leverage, buying their independence with production that they hoped would never be turned against them. The Swiss negotiated this moral maze with clear-eyed pragmatism. They understood that absolute moral purity was incompatible with national survival when surrounded by totalitarian powers. They chose survival, accepting moral compromises that would require accounting after the war ended. This choice deserves neither simple condemnation nor easy excuse. It represents the terrible calculus that small nations face when caught between larger powers, the recognition that sometimes survival requires cooperation with evil while maintaining just enough distance to remain free. When the war finally ended in 1945, Switzerland emerged physically untouched but morally scarred. The nation that had armed itself to resist tyranny had also profited from tyranny. The banks that held Allied assets had processed Nazi gold. The factories that could have armed Swiss soldiers had armed German ones. The borders that could have saved thousands had turned them away. These contradictions would take decades to fully examine, would require investigations and commissions and uncomfortable confrontations with historical truth. Yet through all this moral complexity, Switzerland had achieved its primary objective. It had survived as a free democracy in the heart of fascist Europe. Whether the price paid for that survival was acceptable, whether other choices might have been possible, whether the compromise was necessary or merely convenient, these questions admit no simple answers. They represent the eternal tension between idealism and survival, between moral purity and practical necessity, between what we wish we could be and what circumstances force us to become. Switzerland danced with devils and emerged undevoured, but the dance left marks that time has not entirely erased. There comes a moment in every confrontation when posturing ends and reality begins, when the dance of threat and counter-threat must either escalate into violence or resolve into uneasy peace. For Switzerland, that moment arrived in August 1940, when the maps on Hitler's desk showed German divisions massing along every border, when aerial reconnaissance counted tank formations and artillery batteries, when it became clear that Operation Tannenbaum had moved from theoretical planning to operational preparation. 12 German divisions concentrated along Switzerland's northern frontier. 6 Italian divisions threatened from the south. 300,000 men, 2,000 tanks. Artillery batteries positioned within range of Swiss cities. This was not a training exercise. This was an invasion force, assembled with the same methodical efficiency that had crushed Poland and France, now pointed at the heart of the Alps like a loaded weapon. Swiss intelligence officers plotted German unit movements on large wall maps, watching the red markers multiply along the borders. Each marker represented a regiment, a battalion, a supply column. Together they formed a picture of encirclement, a noose tightening around a nation of 4 million people. General Gissan received these reports in his headquarters, studied the maps with the calm of a man who had prepared for exactly this scenario, and issued orders that demonstrated Switzerland's fundamental strategic principle: when threatened, escalate. On August 10th, 1940. Adolf Hitler himself studied the invasion plans. Imagine him in his office, maps spread across his desk, his generals standing nearby explaining attack routes and objectives. His finger traced the proposed lines of advance, following valleys and passes, pausing at the locations where Swiss defences were known to exist. The briefing would have included casualty estimates, time requirements, logistics calculations, everything his generals had learned about the cost of conquering Switzerland, presented in stark numbers that even ideology could not ignore. We know from historical records that Hitler's reaction mixed strategic calculation with personal rage. The strategic part understood the mathematics. Conquering Switzerland would tie down forces needed elsewhere. The personal part despised Swiss independence, saw their neutrality as an insult to German destiny. These two aspects of Hitler's character warred with each other throughout the summer of 1940, and the outcome of that internal conflict would determine Switzerland's fate. The Swiss did not wait passively for Hitler to decide. They understood that perception mattered, that visible determination could influence calculations. Swiss farmers began painting enormous crosses on their roofs and barns, not small decorations, but massive symbols visible from high altitude, each cross measuring 10 or 20 meters across. Over 40,000 of these crosses appeared throughout the country, a remarkable display of coordinated civil resistance. The purpose was brilliant in its simplicity. German aircraft had repeatedly violated Swiss airspace, and when Swiss fighters shot them down, German officials claimed navigation errors. The weather was poor. The pilot became disoriented. It was an accident. The roof crosses made such excuses impossible. Any German pilot flying over Switzerland would see those crosses constantly, would have no plausible way to claim confusion about which country they were violating. It transformed every airspace violation into an undeniable, deliberate act. Swiss fighters shot down German aircraft 217 times during the war years. 217 times. Each incident created diplomatic tension, required explanations, generated paperwork, but each incident also demonstrated that Swiss airspace was defended, that Swiss pilots would engage even vastly superior Luftwaffe formations, that Switzerland's neutrality had teeth. The roof crosses ensured that Germany could never dismiss these shootdowns as unfortunate mistakes. The moment of maximum danger arrived on June 23, 1940, when France signed its armistice with Germany. Switzerland awoke that morning surrounded entirely by Axis powers. Every border now faced hostile or occupied territory. The geographic isolation was complete. Yet that very night, Swiss engineers received orders that still echo through military history with their apocalyptic finality. Prepare all demolitions for immediate execution. Authorization code word is Ragnarok. Ragnarok. The Norse apocalypse, the end of the world. The Swiss chose this code word deliberately, understanding its mythological weight. In Norse legend, Ragnarok represents the final battle where gods and giants destroy each other utterly, where the world burns and sinks into the sea before being reborn. Switzerland was declaring its willingness to enact its own apocalypse, to destroy itself rather than submit. German signals intelligence intercepted these orders. Wehrmacht cryptographers decoded the message. Engineers analyzed what it meant operationally. Their calculations produced numbers that made invasion planners reconsider everything. Switzerland could isolate itself completely within 6 minutes. 6 minutes from authorization to execution. Every bridge dropped, every tunnel collapsed, every road severed. The country would become unreachable except by mountain trails that could be defended indefinitely. Consider what this meant for German planning. An invasion required logistics, required supply, lines, required the ability to reinforce success and exploit breakthrough. Switzerland was threatening to eliminate all of that in less time than it takes to prepare breakfast. German armour might break through initial positions, might achieve tactical victories, but those victories would become strategic disasters when the units found themselves isolated in hostile territory with no way to resupply or reinforce or even retreat. The summer of 1940 became a test of wills conducted through symbols and signals. German divisions massed, Switzerland armed its demolitions, German aircraft probed defences, Swiss fighters engaged them. German diplomats delivered veiled threats. Swiss officials responded with quiet determination. Neither side blinked, but neither side pulled the trigger. The dance continued day after day, each side calculating whether escalation served their interests. Hitler studied the problem repeatedly through that summer. Different generals presented different solutions. Perhaps a sudden strike before Switzerland could react. But Swiss demolition teams were already at their positions, already had authorization codes, already could execute in minutes. Perhaps a limited operation to secure specific objectives, but Switzerland had made clear that any violation would trigger total response. Perhaps economic pressure and diplomatic isolation, but Switzerland's banking services and transit routes made them valuable enough that isolation would hurt Germany almost as much. The Führer's frustration grew with each analysis. Switzerland represented everything he despised: democracy, neutrality, stubborn independence from German destiny. He wanted to eliminate it, to erase this stubborn anomaly from his map of Europe. But wanting and achieving are different things, and even Hitler's will could not overcome the mathematical reality his generals presented. Switzerland would cost too much to conquer for what little strategic value it offered. August passed into September. September into October. The German divisions along Switzerland's borders began receiving new orders. Some moved west to prepare for the invasion of Britain that never came. Some moved east to prepare for the invasion of Russia that would doom Germany. The immediate threat to Switzerland slowly dissipated, not because Germany had changed its assessment of Swiss defences, but because Germany's strategic priorities shifted to objectives that seemed more achievable. Yet Operation Tannenbaum remained in German files, continued to be updated with new intelligence, and remained ready for execution if circumstances changed. The Swiss understood this. They maintained their preparations, kept their mobilization ready, ensured that every demolition charge remained armed and positioned. The entire war passed with Switzerland standing ready to destroy itself at 6 minutes' notice, a nation holding a loaded weapon pointed at its own infrastructure, daring anyone to force them to pull the trigger. The psychological warfare implicit in this standoff deserves appreciation. Switzerland was not claiming they could defeat Germany, they were claiming they could make victory meaningless. They were offering Germany a choice: leave us alone and we remain useful, attack us and we become a devastated wasteland that drains your resources for years. This was deterrence not through strength but through threatened self-destruction, a strategy that required absolute credibility and unwavering commitment. The credibility came from Switzerland's history and character. This was a nation that had fought for independence for centuries, that had maintained neutrality through the Napoleonic Wars and the First World War, that took its sovereignty seriously enough to prepare elaborate defences during peacetime. When Switzerland threatened to destroy its own infrastructure rather than surrender, Germany had to believe the threat was genuine, and believing it genuine had to calculate whether conquest justified the cost. The commitment showed in every detail of Swiss preparation. The demolition charges were real, professionally installed, regularly maintained. The fortresses were stocked and manned. The army trained constantly. The citizens understood their roles. This was not a bluff that might crumble under pressure. This was a nation that had structured its entire society around the principle that freedom was worth any sacrifice, including national suicide. As autumn arrived in 1940, Switzerland remained armed and ready, surrounded but undefeated, threatened but defiant. The dragon had circled, had tested the defences, had calculated the cost, and had chosen, for now, to seek easier prey. But the Swiss knew that reprieve was not victory, that the threat could return at any moment, that eternal vigilance remained the price of independence. They maintained their watch, kept their guns loaded, preserved their demolition plans, and waited to see whether survival would require pulling the trigger they had kept aimed at their own heart. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, when the Nazi Empire crumbled into rubble and ash, Switzerland emerged from 6 years of total mobilization, facing a different kind of judgment. The physical landscape remained untouched. No bombs had fallen on Swiss cities, no tanks had torn up Swiss roads, no artillery had reduced Swiss villages to ruins, but the moral landscape bore scars that would take generations to examine, wounds that opened deeper the more closely they were inspected. Allied investigators arrived in Switzerland that summer, carrying briefcases full of questions and mandates to follow the money. What they discovered in the underground vaults of Swiss banks made headlines worldwide. 300 tons of Nazi gold. 300 tons. Some of it legitimate, seized from national banks of conquered countries. Much of it not legitimate at all, melted down from jewelry and dental fillings confiscated from Holocaust victims, transformed from personal tragedy into fungible bars stamped with the German eagle. The numbers carried their own prosecution. Swiss banks had processed approximately 2 billion Swiss francs of Nazi transactions during the war years. They had asked few questions about origin, had maintained the discretion that made Swiss banking famous, had provided services that helped the Nazi war machine convert plunder into purchasing power. The profit margins were modest by banking standards, but the moral deficit was enormous. Yet the investigation revealed layers of complexity that resisted simple judgment. Those same Swiss banks had protected Allied assets throughout the war. British investments that might have been seized by Germany remained safe in Swiss vaults. American holdings stayed liquid and accessible. French accounts frozen when France fell remained intact, waiting for liberation. Switzerland had maintained a financial neutral zone that served all sides, and while this neutrality enabled Nazi transactions, it also preserved wealth that might otherwise have vanished. The industrial cooperation proved equally troubling under examination. Swiss factories had produced 40% of Germany's artillery time fuses. 40%. These were not neutral components. These were weapons parts, essential for German artillery to function, directly contributing to Wehrmacht effectiveness. Swiss ball bearings, precision instruments, and watch movements had kept German war production running. Without Swiss manufacturing, Germany's ability to wage war would have diminished measurably. The defense offered by Swiss officials mixed pragmatism with necessity. They argued that providing these supplies made invasion unnecessary, that keeping German forces supplied kept them from seizing Swiss factories outright. Better to sell under Swiss terms than to have production taken by force. The argument had logical merit, but it required accepting that Swiss workers had armed the very forces Swiss soldiers prepared to fight. The contradiction troubled many Swiss citizens who had spent the war ready to die, defending their country, while their neighbours worked in factories supplying its enemies. Against this record of collaboration sat the humanitarian accounting. 300,000 refugees had found shelter in Switzerland during the war, 300,000 people who might otherwise have died. The Swiss government had spent 1.2 billion francs on refugee support, roughly a quarter of the national budget. This represented an enormous commitment of resources by a small nation already bearing the costs of total mobilization. The refugee statistics told their own complex story. 24,000 turned away at the borders. Many of those people died in the Holocaust. This failure haunts Switzerland still, represents decisions that prioritize security over compassion, that chose to protect Swiss interests at the cost of Jewish lives. But 62,000 others found sanctuary, found food and shelter and safety, survived the war because Switzerland opened its doors. 5,000 Allied airmen, shot down and escaping to Swiss territory, received comfortable internment and eventually went home. Which number matters more, the thousands saved or the thousands turned away? The question admits no comfortable answer. The military accounting revealed secrets that shocked even Allied intelligence services. General Guisan, in previously classified documents released after the war, had maintained a final contingency plan that few knew about during the conflict. If invasion appeared imminent, if German forces seemed poised to strike, Switzerland would not wait to be attacked. Swiss forces would launch preemptive strikes on German airfields and supply depots across the border. Imagine the implications. Switzerland, officially neutral, secretly planning offensive operations against Germany. Not defensive reactions, but preemptive attacks designed to bloody the Wehrmacht before invasion began. The targets had been surveyed. The strike plans existed. Artillery units had calculated ranges to German positions. The orders simply awaited Guisan's signature. This was neutrality armed with fangs, prepared to strike first rather than absorb the initial blow. The rationale was coldly logical. If invasion was inevitable, better to strike when German forces were still assembling than to wait until they achieved full combat readiness. Better to destroy German aircraft on the ground than to fight them in the air. Better to disrupt supply depots before they could support an invasion than to face fully supplied assault forces. The Swiss had calculated that preemptive strikes might not prevent invasion, but would ensure Germany was too bloodied to continue offensive operations elsewhere for months. This contingency plan revealed the ultimate sophistication of Swiss strategy. They had prepared not just to defend, but to make their defense so costly that it would impact Germany's entire strategic position. Switzerland was willing to sacrifice itself, but that sacrifice would take German forces with it, would create a wound in the Wehrmacht that would bleed for months. This was deterrence through threatened mutual destruction, taken to its logical extreme. The international commission that investigated Swiss conduct spent 3 years examining documents, interviewing witnesses, analyzing financial records. Their final report, published in 1948, concluded with a paradox that captures the essential truth of Switzerland's wartime experience. Switzerland had survived by being useful to evil, while using that position to save thousands and maintain democracy in the heart of fascist Europe. The report noted that without Swiss banking services, German access to international markets would have been severely constrained. Without Swiss manufacturing, German war production would have suffered. Without Swiss transit routes, Axis logistics would have faced additional complications. Switzerland's neutrality had provided tangible benefits to Nazi Germany, had enabled the regime in measurable ways. Yet that same neutrality had also constrained Germany. The Wehrmacht had to detour around Switzerland, had to guard borders against potential Swiss reaction, had to accept that certain transit routes required Swiss permission. The existence of an armed, neutral Switzerland in the heart of Europe had forced Germany to maintain forces on guard duty that might otherwise have fought on active fronts. The refugee operations had saved thousands of lives. The intelligence networks had provided allies with valuable information. The very fact that democracy survived in Central Europe, even if compromised, offered proof that totalitarianism was not inevitable. The Commission's conclusion satisfied no one completely. Those who wanted Switzerland condemned as a Nazi collaborator found too much evidence of resistance and humanitarian action. Those who wanted Switzerland celebrated as a beacon of freedom found too much evidence of cooperation with evil. The truth resided in the uncomfortable middle, in the recognition that survival in impossible circumstances requires compromises that resist easy moral categorization. Switzerland itself struggled with this reckoning. Veterans who had spent years manning fortresses, ready to die defending their country, learned that their factories had armed the enemy. Bankers who had maintained financial neutrality faced accusations of collaboration. Officials who had turned away refugees at borders carried guilt that would last their lifetimes. The nation that had prepared for total resistance had also profited from the war it prepared to resist. The moral complexity of Switzerland's wartime experience offers no simple lessons, but it illuminates eternal questions about how nations survive existential threats. Is cooperation with evil justified if it prevents conquest? Is neutrality possible when surrounded by totalitarianism? Or does neutrality itself become a form of collaboration? Can a nation maintain its values while making compromises necessary for survival? These questions have no universal answers, only context-dependent judgments that future generations will debate endlessly. What remains undeniable is that Switzerland emerged from the war as a free democracy when every nation surrounding it had fallen to fascism. The price paid for that freedom included moral compromises that stain the historical record, but the alternative would have been conquest, occupation, and the imposition of Nazi ideology on another 4 million people. Given those choices, Switzerland chose survival with compromised values over destruction with pure principles. Whether that choice deserves condemnation or understanding depends on whether we judge from the comfort of hindsight or the terror of the moment when the choice had to be made. Stand today at the entrance to Fort Führingen, a decommissioned fortress now open to visitors, and you can see history preserved in steel and stone. The massive doors, weighing 17 tons each, still swing open on hinges so perfectly balanced that a child could move them. They were designed to seal in seconds, to transform the fortress from open installation to sealed vault faster than an artillery shell could travel from a distant gun. Run your hand along the cold metal and feel the precision of Swiss engineering, the dedication to perfection that characterized every element of the national redoubt. Walk through those doors into corridors carved from living granite, and you enter spaces where men lived for months at a time, never seeing sunlight, breathing recycled air, existing in an underground world dedicated entirely to the mathematics of destruction. The gun emplacements remain, massive artillery pieces pointed through apertures at valleys they commanded for decades. The sighting systems still work. The range tables still hang on walls. Everything preserved as it was, a museum of deterrence, a monument to the strategy that kept Switzerland free. Peer through the gun ports and consider what enemy soldiers would have seen in those final seconds before shells began falling. Nothing. No indication of danger. Just innocent mountainside, natural rock formations, peaceful alpine landscape. The genius of Swiss camouflage was making death invisible until the moment it arrived. Even now, knowing the fortress exists, standing inside it, it remains difficult to identify the gun ports from outside. The deception still functions decades after its purpose ended. But Fort Führingen represents more than historical curiosity. It embodies a principle that Switzerland has never abandoned, a commitment that survived the Cold War and persists into our present age. The Swiss military still maintains 7,000 bunkers and fortified positions throughout the country. 7,000. Most are hidden, integrated into civilian infrastructure, indistinguishable from ordinary buildings. Highway overpasses conceal firing positions. Mountain chalets hide ammunition depots. The landscape remains weaponized, ready to transform from peaceful to lethal with the same speed that characterized preparations in 1940. Switzerland can still mobilize 200,000 troops within 48 hours, 200,000 soldiers from a population of 8.5 million. This represents a larger proportion of population under arms than almost any other developed nation maintains. Every Swiss man still serves in the militia, still keeps his rifle at home, still trains regularly throughout his adult life. The system that defended against Hitler remains operational, adapted for modern threats but fundamentally unchanged in its core principle. Make Switzerland too expensive to conquer. Modern. Swiss defense spending reflects this commitment. 12 billion Swiss francs annually, more per capita than any European nation. This is not symbolic spending. This is not a small nation maintaining token forces for political purposes. This is serious investment in serious capability, the kind of budget that purchases real military power. Swiss fighter jets patrol the same airspace that shot down German aircraft in 1940. Swiss artillery still commands the same Alpine passes. The targets may have changed, but the vigilance has not. Look closely at highway bridges built since 1960, and you will notice something peculiar. Small chambers built into the support structures, empty spaces that seem to serve no obvious purpose. These are demolition chambers, pre-positioned locations where explosive charges can be installed rapidly. Every highway bridge in Switzerland contains these chambers. Every tunnel includes blast doors that can seal in 4 seconds. The infrastructure itself remains designed for instant demolition, for transformation from transportation network to defensive barrier at a moment's notice. This is not paranoia. This is institutional memory. The recognition that the world can change with frightening speed, that nations that fail to prepare may find themselves unprepared. Switzerland learned in 1940 that preparation takes years, but invasion can begin in hours. They learned that deterrence requires credibility, and credibility requires visible commitment. The demolition chambers in modern bridges announce to any potential attacker, we remain willing to destroy what we have built rather than surrender it. The strategy born from existential crisis has evolved into eternal principle. Make your country too expensive to conquer. Make yourself too useful to destroy. Maintain unity that cannot be divided. These 3 elements formed the core of Switzerland's survival in 1940, and they remain the core of Swiss defense policy today. The specific threats have changed. The Cold War replaced Nazi Germany with Soviet communism. The post-Cold War era brought different challenges, but the fundamental approach endures. When Russian armies invaded Ukraine in February 2022, military planners worldwide suddenly rediscovered interest in a strategy written 80 years earlier. Ukrainian defense officials contacted Swiss military colleges requesting information about the national redoubt concept. 400 Ukrainian officers sought to study how Switzerland had planned to resist a vastly superior force, how a small nation could make invasion catastrophic, how determination and preparation could substitute for overwhelming power. The parallels were not exact. Ukraine's geography differs dramatically from Switzerland's. The political situations have different contexts, but the underlying principle resonates across time and circumstance. A nation that prepares thoroughly, that arms its population, that demonstrates absolute commitment to resistance, can make conquest so expensive that rational attackers reconsider. Switzerland proved this principle in 1940. Ukraine is attempting to prove it again today. Military historians studying the national redoubt strategy have documented its influence far beyond Europe. Finland's defense planning incorporates Swiss concepts, maintaining 800,000 reservists who can mobilize rapidly, preparing to make invasion of their country prohibitively costly. Singapore's total defense system draws directly from Swiss models, organizing the entire nation for resistance, ensuring that 1 million citizens can be mobilized within 72 hours. Taiwan studies Swiss fortification techniques. Israel incorporates Swiss militia concepts. The Alpine Republic's strategy has become template for modern porcupine defense worldwide. The term porcupine defense itself derives from Switzerland's example. Like the animal it is named for, this strategy does not rely on aggression or power projection. It relies on making the target indigestible, on growing quills sharp enough that predators choose easier prey. The porcupine does not chase threats. It does not claim territory beyond its own body. It simply makes clear that consumption will be painful, that the predator will suffer wounds not worth the meal. This is deterrence through threatened cost rather than threatened retaliation. Consider what Switzerland proved through its wartime experience. A nation of 4 million people, with limited natural resources, with no significant power projection capability, successfully deterred the most aggressive military power of its era, not through alliance, not through submission, but through careful preparation, through credible commitment, through making conquest more expensive than any rational calculation could justify. This achievement deserves recognition as one of history's most successful applications of strategic defense. The lessons extend beyond military strategy into questions of national character and political will. Switzerland's success required national unity that transcended normal political divisions. German-speaking Swiss stood with French-speaking Swiss. Urban populations supported rural militia. Bankers and farmers, workers and executives all accepted their roles in national defense. This unity did not emerge spontaneously. It grew from centuries of shared history, from institutions that fostered collective identity, from education that emphasized citizenship over individualism. Modern democracies studying Swiss defense strategy often miss this crucial element. They focus on fortifications and mobilization plans, on technical aspects of artillery placement and demolition preparation. But the foundation of Swiss success was not technical. It was social and political. It was the willingness of an entire population to accept sacrifice, to maintain readiness, to subordinate individual comfort, to collective security. Without this social foundation, the technical preparations would have been meaningless. The question facing contemporary democracies is whether such unity remains possible in our fragmented age. Can nations divided by ideology, separated by class, fractured by information bubbles, achieve the collective commitment that Switzerland demonstrated? Or was Swiss success a product of specific historical circumstances that cannot be replicated? These questions have no certain answers, but they deserve serious consideration as threats to democratic nations multiply. What remains certain is that Switzerland's strategy offers an alternative to the binary choice between accommodation and confrontation. It demonstrates that small nations need not choose between submission and suicidal resistance. There exists a third path: preparation so thorough, commitment so visible, cost calculation so obvious that conflict becomes irrational. This path requires investment and sacrifice, requires maintaining capabilities that may never be used, requires explaining to each generation why preparation matters even in peacetime. The Swiss have maintained this commitment for over 80 years since their strategy saved them in 1940. They have preserved fortresses and maintained militias and updated demolition plans through decades when direct threats seem distant. They have accepted the cost of readiness because they understand that threats can emerge faster than preparations can be made. This is the eternal vigil, the constant watch that free people must maintain if they wish to remain free. Stand again at Fort Furigen, looking out through those gun ports at the peaceful valley below. Imagine what might have been if Switzerland had not prepared, had not armed itself, had not made credible its commitment to resist. The valley might look the same, the mountains would still rise, eternal, but the nation watching over them might have fallen, might have spent years under occupation, might have lost that precious thread of continuous democracy that stretches back centuries. The fortress prevented that fate, not by firing its guns, but by making clear that the guns would fire if necessary. This is Switzerland's gift to the world, proof that democracy can defend itself, that small nations can survive among large ones, that freedom requires vigilance, but that vigilance can preserve freedom. The porcupine still watches from its alpine redoubt, quills raised, patient and prepared, demonstrating forever that those who make themselves indigestible need never be consumed. The eternal vigil continues, and in its continuation lies the hope that other democracies, other small nations threatened by larger neighbours, other free people facing tyranny, they might find inspiration and instruction in how 4 million Swiss citizens made themselves unconquerable through sheer determination to remain free.